it is extremely exciting to be here at CCSU talking 10 years later about justice reinvestment, and I want to thank the President for his opening remarks. And I still call him Representative Dyson, to hear you talking about these issues in Connecticut and all that it's meant nationally, and getting to work with you, as Andrew mentioned, is one of the key architects of the whole justice reinvestment package many years ago. And Andrew, for all of you knowing him so well, is just this remarkable combination of super smart on the policy and all the ins and outs of the issues, but then also connects that with the politics. And just as a quick illustration of that, a quick story, I know when Andrew first called me from the Capitol and suggested that I get together with Representative Dyson to talk to him, I said, okay, you know, I'll head over to the Legislative Office building, you know, keeping in mind that I don't know Connecticut very well from out of state. And he said, no, you're not going to come to the Legislative Office building. I said, well, where do I go? And he said, well, you're going to go to New Haven. And I said, okay, where do I go in New Haven? He said, you're going to go to Clark's Dairy. I said, what's Clark's Dairy? He said, just look it up. You're going to go to Clark's Dairy. You'll find Representative Dyson there. And he's like, that's the kind of expert guidance, right, that I needed at the time, along with the substantive issues. So, Andrew, thank you very much for all the help over the years. The reason why I'm so excited about coming here, I'm going to quote a country singer, and I'm going to be in Alabama next week presenting the legislature there and the governor's folks, and I'm probably better off quoting country in Alabama than I am in Connecticut. But the line I think of from the country music artist was, I was country before country was cool. You know, you were justice reinvestment before justice reinvestment was cool. You know, you were really the pioneers of so much of what's happened nationally, and it's just exciting to reflect on that. And then being on this panel with Bill and Renee and Pat Hynes and Bob Farr, it's just very exciting for me. And I was so excited getting ready for this trip last night. When my kids asked me where I was headed for this meeting today, I was about to tell them, and it reminded me, though, quickly of a story that I want to tell you, which is not too long ago, my kids asked me after a day of work where I had been. And for those of you with young kids, you know, for your kids to take any interest whatsoever in what you actually do at work is a fairly unique event. So I thought I really had to impress them, and it just so happened during that day, and so I was very excited. I said, well, you know, it just so happens today I was in Washington, D.C., where the president works. And they said, wow, and I had their attention. They said, you were meeting with the people who work for the president? And I said, well, not exactly. They actually work for the vice president's office in domestic policy, so it's not exactly the same thing. And they were drifting away, sort of, you know, not as interested now. And they looked at me one more time and they said, but you were in the White House, right? I said, well, not exactly. I was next door in the old executive office building, but it's kind of, you got to go through Secret Service, and now they're long gone, right? No longer interested. And I got one last moment to salvage things, and I said, you know, when I was waiting to get through security, you'll never guess who I ran into. And they're like, who? And I said, Bono, the lead singer of U2. True story, right? And they're like, that's pretty cool. He's kind of old, but that's pretty cool, right? So I'm feeling a lot better about things. I've redeemed myself, right? Next week at the soccer field, I happen to coach my kid's soccer team. A bunch of parents walking to me across the field after the game, grinning ear to ear. And I said, and they said, Mike, man, you know, and way to go, man. And I was like, you know, yeah, it was a nice win on the soccer field. And they're like, no, we found out what you do. And I said, well, you know, I do work on crime policy issues and talk to states. They said, no. Our kids tell us you work in the White House with Bono. Trying to figure out how I'm going to spin this, you know, and make sure my kids can be impressed. Again, I think it's a big deal. With that, I want to sort of walk you through my presentation. Again, Council of State Governments is a membership association. We represent all elected and appointed state government officials. Very conservative folks from Texas, very liberal folks from Massachusetts, and everything in between. We focus on those areas where there is bipartisan consensus about how to improve public safety and reduce spending. My presentation today is going to have three parts. The first is I want to talk about how the efforts here have really blazed a trail nationally. That's sort of the 10-year view. And then I want to take a look at where you fit into the national context today. And then after that, I want to talk about some opportunities that I see for Connecticut going forward. So those are the three things that I'm going to look at during this presentation. So this is what the prison population has done over that 10-year period, and Renee and her folks, put together all these numbers. And of course, not long after 9/11, right, we had that incredible sort of budget crunch where there was that crisis atmosphere in the legislature. You had, at that point, people that you were sending out of state to Virginia. This was the prison population, right, just around 17,500. And that prison population was accelerating, the growth of it was, after that budget crisis, after cuts were made to various forms of community-based treatment services, increasing caseloads for probation, and the population stood at a record high of 18,700. That's when this legislation was signed, in putting it together, one of the things that Representative Dyson and others commissioned was an analysis of the communities that were most affected by the growth in the prison population and the very high rates of revocation of people on probation and parole. You won't be surprised that he suggested we do a map of New Haven. And so in particular, I show you a map that we showed, as Andrew will recall, to the Judiciary and Appropriations Committee. This was a map in particular of showing in the Hill in New Haven, where the state was spending about $20 million a year to send people from that particular neighborhood to prison, about over $6 million revoking people from probation alone in that, again, small part of New Haven. And we also showed that this was precisely the same communities where the state was spending disproportionately in terms of unemployment claims and people receiving TANF benefits. And you see there on the far left where the highest concentration of probationers was. This was the headline that came out of the plan. You can see passing unanimously the support that legislative package had. The idea was to reduce probation technical violations, to improve compliance with conditions of release for parolees, to really rethink how parole release was being done. And these were the results. The state talked about not just only saving money by bringing inmates back from Virginia, but actually taking some of those monies and reinvesting them in various forms of community-based services and treatment. Part of that wasn't focused just on probationers and parolees. It was also, we talked about actually reinvesting in those very same neighborhoods. It turned out that $1 million of that $14 million was reinvested in those particular neighborhoods. It ended up focusing more on supportive housing for that particular population. Some of that, I think, in retrospect, we all wondered, was that the kind of reinvestment in communities that had originally been envisioned? So I think that's one area that maybe didn't necessarily follow through with a vision that had been achieved, but it still was this remarkable combination of things. And you can see here in 2004, the prison population at 18,700 actually ends up declining after that package was passed. Then in 2007, tragedy strikes the state, national news, horrific event. I'll never forget a national meeting at which we were at, in which a number of Connecticut lawmakers were there, covers of every major national publication, people, tears streaming down faces, an incredibly emotional time. And frankly, we all thought, well, this is when you throw everything out the window and you just crack down, right? This is when you just do the feel-good things that you have to do to make sure that everybody can feel safe. And what happened there was pretty extraordinary, I thought. The state didn't just simply say, here's just a bunch of things that other states have done that is going to make everybody feel safe. You did what you did in 2004, which is you got everybody together again, you looked at the data, and you said, how do we take the latest science to make sure that this kind of tragedy doesn't happen? One of the things that you did was actually talk about better implementing risk assessment, right? The science-based approach to better understanding how people and what people will reoffend. You adopted the ORAS, the Ohio Risk Assessment Instrument, which I understand now is just being implemented. So lots of important things happening after that incident. The prison population grows to close to 20,000, and then this remarkable thing happens, which is the state becomes even safer, as I'll show you with crime data, and your prison population declines. So really pushed through two extraordinary crises in this 10-year period, and I think have extremely impressive results to show for it. And you'll see that in 2002, when we first were talking to Connecticut, you were one of the fastest growing prison populations in the country. You see yourself over there on the far end with an 8% year-to-year growth. When we looked at 2010 to 2012, you can see that you are the state with one of the fastest declining prison populations in the country. You are at the far end of the other side of this bar graph. So that's a nice place to be, as long as you can also demonstrate, and I'll show you here, that probation population is down, parole population a little bit up, but still one of a very low parole population per capita when compared to the rest of the country. Recidivism rates also down. You can see here that no matter how we look at recidivism, whether it's arrest or return to prison or a new conviction, you can see significant declines, even a double-digit decline in new conviction form of recidivism. And then I think perhaps most importantly, from a public perspective, public safety increased, crime rates dropping in the state. So you have all of these nice trends combining. And I know sometimes everything looks bleak when you're just sort of focused on what's going on in that particular day. But when you zoom back the camera lens and really look what's happened over this time period, especially when you were in the face of some of these crises, you can see that a lot of these numbers are headed in the right direction. And the nation has taken notice. This idea of justice reinvestment, which Connecticut was the first to really move ahead, is now something that states across the country proudly tout as their own. Here are pictures of Governor Kasich in Ohio, then Governor Perdue in North Carolina, Governor Corbett in Pennsylvania. Guess which one is the governor of Hawaii? The governor of West Virginia, Governor Brownback in Kansas, all within the past couple of years proudly signing legislation they call justice reinvestment that gets them more public safety for less spending. And just to show you some maps, because they love the maps that you did in Connecticut and thought it really illustrated things, look at the way Arizona took the mapping exercise. They focused here in general Phoenix, where 60% of the state's population is from. I'm going to zoom into Phoenix right here and show you one neighborhood that's 1% of the state's population, but nearly 7% of the state's prison population. I'm going to zoom further in, so I'm zooming further in here to Phoenix, and now you'll see even greater concentrations of people from particular neighborhoods going to prison. You can see here various what we call million-dollar blocks. And then look even closer, right? I'm going to zoom into this particular neighborhood, a house-by-house map of people on probation in that particular neighborhood in Arizona. This is the kind of thinking that you stimulated across the country. Arizona passed legislation saying if they could reduce probation revocation rates in that neighborhood, the county could keep part of that money to reinvest in other local strategies. Congress takes notice. President Obama takes notice. Here you have Senator Cornyn and Senator Leahy, right? They don't agree on anything. Hardcore Republican from Texas, Democrat from Vermont, who are sponsoring national legislation called Justice Reinvestment. President Obama, in his budget for FY14, recommends $85 million, a jump from $5 million to fund justice reinvestment across the country. You all saw the headlines in the paper this morning that a spending bill has just been agreed on. We have the numbers internally, I can't release them, about what Republican appropriators and Democrat appropriators agreed on for justice reinvestment. It's a significant increase, and again, a major tribute to what's been accomplished first here. So, wow, right? Congratulations, you all deserve a round of applause. You know, this is quite extraordinary what you've achieved. Let's see where you fit today in the national context. As Representative Dyson said, it's been 10 years, right? I mean, a lot of things happened that good, but also maybe some opportunities for perspective. Frankly, as I'll show you, I think some states have leapfrogged you in some ways as they've had the advantage of doing this more recently and create some opportunities for you to look at things here. You can see here that 2/3 of the states have a higher total incarceration rate than Connecticut. So when I look nationally, you have a low incarceration rate when compared to the rest of the country. And I know everybody in Connecticut's going to tell me, now wait a minute, does this take into account the fact that we're a unified system and many of the other states are not a unified system? Yes, it does. I'm looking at incarceration rates here for people sentenced to a year or more. So that's what I'm looking at in terms of when I compare incarceration rates from one state to the next. You can see here that your total index crime rate, that's a combination of very serious property crimes and violent crimes, is also one of the lowest in the country. That's the nice place to be. You can also see that you're actually spending less on corrections than you did. Nearby states like New York and New Jersey proudly tout the fact that they've closed prisons, but they haven't been able to cut corrections spending as a net like you have. So that's another nice achievement that Connecticut's been able to accomplish. So that's some data about where you fit nationally, but now I want to go to some opportunities that I see, especially when I compare you to states that I think that you're more likely to compare yourself against. I know that you don't necessarily automatically think of Connecticut and Texas, together when you're trying to compare states. Maybe you're thinking more about places like New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts. Well, when I look in the Northeast, what I see here is that you have one of the lower crime rates in the Northeast, but one of the highest incarceration rates, right? That's interesting to me. That basically says, are you actually getting the most public safety, for the least amount of money, right? That's what we want to do. We want to buy you the most public safety for the least amount of money possible. And you have a very high incarceration rate when I compare you to the Northeast. And again, that's accounting for the fact that you're a unified system, and you have a high rate of people on probation supervision. Who's higher than you? You're probably curious. Pennsylvania. Nobody else in the Northeast. So I want to draw for you, go through a little exercise. This is the index crime, right? So this is index crime per 100,000 residents. You want to be as far left on this graph as you possibly can, right? Because you want the lowest crime rate possible. And then I'm going to show you on this axis here your incarceration rate. So you want to be as low on this bar as you can, right? That's the most public safety for the least amount of money. So you want to be as close as you can to that lower left-hand corner. This is where you are. This is where Pennsylvania is. All right, so Pennsylvania is the one state that's getting less public safety for more money than you. But look what happens when I compare you to Maine, Rhode Island, New Hampshire. Those states actually, when I look at their total index crime, which includes property crime, a slightly higher crime rate than Connecticut, and also dramatically lower incarceration rates. What about states like New York and New Jersey? Here you see those states in Massachusetts. They're safer and they have lower incarceration rates. We want to push you closer to the left-hand side and lower, right? So how do we do that? And I think that's a really interesting opportunity to begin to say, maybe it's time 10 years later to take another look at justice reinvestment, figure out some new things that we can do to make the state even safer than it was before. And along these lines, I think of, for example, I mentioned back in this graph right here, I don't want to give you the impression that really things stopped when you had those comprehensive changes in 2008, 2009. I know that, was it 2012, Raise the Age? I'm looking at Tao Foundation, Tony Walker, some great things that were done there that moved a lot of the 16 and 17-year-olds out of Department of Corrections. Governor Cuomo wants to follow suit. He talked about that in his State of the State address. You also talked about making sure that when people complete programs that actually have an impact on their risk of recidivism, that they will have actually earned time off of their sentence. A lot of states just do earn time, right? And you just get it for just being there. Other states don't create an incentive for you to complete some of these programs. Connecticut has actually thought about how to merge those things. Federal government, people like Senator Rob Portman trying to apply that idea to the federal system. So another example of things that you've done post-2008 that I think are interesting kind of science-based approaches. The other thing, though, that's an opportunity in addition to this is your pretrial population, right? A greater percentage of your population is pretrial than it was just in 2008. That said, there might be an interesting opportunity there to have a better impact on your pretrial population. I showed you these recidivism numbers earlier, and there's really two ways of looking at this. On the one hand, I can tell you the good news is your recidivism rates are down, but there's two other things here that I want to call your attention to. Number one, these are 2-year recidivism rates, right? So most of the country, when we talk national recidivism data, they have 3-year recidivism rates. So, right, it's going to follow that when I have a 3-year recidivism rate instead of a 2-year, it's going to be a higher measure, right? Because you have a longer window to follow people. Recognizing that when I take 3-year recidivism rates, these numbers look high, right? So your numbers look high when I take a 3-year recidivism rate. When I talk about a return to prison at 47.5%, that's high when I compare it to a lot of what we're seeing in other states. So I would say there's an opportunity too, potentially, to do even better. And again, I look at Bill Carbone, who's really shown what's possible through probation and real science-based approaches. Continuing to apply that, I think you can get even better results. The other issue is that these data are somewhat old. This is 2008, which means that the window stopped in 2010. What happened in 2011, 2012, 2013? Those are numbers that you should have at your fingertips. I think that speaks to really the capacity that needs to be built in Connecticut to make sure that those numbers are always available to policymakers and you don't have the kind of lag time that you need. I know it's not that you don't value those things, but the fact of the matter is that information isn't there, and that's something that also might be good to look at through a justice reinvestment process. This is something that is supported by the Bureau of Justice Assistance and the Pew Charitable Trusts. In order to engage a state through justice reinvestment, you have to do what you did 10 years ago, which is demonstrate the buy-in of the governor and leaders of both political parties. I remember Senator Kissel being instrumental in the justice reinvestment package in 2004, and I'm delighted that he'll be on a panel later this afternoon. Other things that we can talk about in terms of your incarceration rate. Why is your pretrial population growing? How can you make your recidivism rates go down even further? Are there ways to better improve upon the parole decision-making process? And I just want to give you an example of some of the science that's coming out now that I think you may be able to apply. Do I have like 2 more minutes, Andrew? Am I right? So risk assessment, right? This country has become much more sophisticated using science-based tools, not just as Representative Dyson was talking about earlier, do you have this scarlet letter or not, right? Was this what you were convicted of? But actually taking a whole host of information to really determine what the likelihood is of someone reoffending. And we know when we look at the whole population and we say without risk assessment, everyone looks more or less the same, and we get decision makers who focus maybe only on a criminal history or perhaps just the offense for which someone was convicted of. With risk assessment, we can better divide populations into, within that group, who has a higher likelihood of reoffending. And so we have this lower risk group, and then you have a moderate and a high. So it's not that 70% of these people will be rearrested, but rather that there's a much higher likelihood of these people being arrested than, say, the people who are in this low risk column. David DeMora is with us. We were thrilled to lure him from Connecticut and one of your fantastic nonprofit agencies. He directs our National Reentry Resource Center, among other things, and really helping the country get sophisticated in this area. Ohio, like you, has a fantastically sophisticated group of nonprofits working in the area of recidivism reduction. They did a study of all of those different programs across the state. This is program by program. The red bars are those programs that are actually increasing recidivism, right? Those programs, on balance, are actually increasing the numbers of people going back to prison, as opposed to if they had not had the quote-unquote good fortune of going to those programs at all. The blue bars are the ones that are actually reducing recidivism rates. Ohio's net investment of $100 million was actually having the net impact of increasing recidivism across the state. How in the world can that be, right? What is the matter with Ohio? Actually, kudos to Ohio for actually taking a hard look at this. We know that a lot of the people being sent to these programs were not necessarily people who were most likely to recidivate. They were people that maybe a judge or a parole officer or the parole board thought would benefit from that program, but when they inadvertently put a low-risk person in that program, they ended up meeting high-risk people who taught them bad habits. They ended up supervising a low-risk person more intensively than they should have, which then had the net impact of pulling a person away from a job or a family member and increasing the likelihood of recidivism. What about Connecticut? How are we doing in that area, right? That would be an interesting area to study. And again, this is sort of the net impact of when they're targeting that higher risk population, look at the impact they're having on recidivism. What did Ohio do? They actually legislated criteria for some of these programs and made sure that criminal justice decision makers were using the right criteria to send the right people to the right programs. Now, we know a lot of these people also have substance abuse problems. But at the same time, we know that substance abuse problems can really span a very broad spectrum, right? You can have abstinence all the way to dependence and everything in between. We have to be very nuanced about what we mean when we say the person has a substance abuse problem rather than they have it or they don't, right? Similarly, when we talk about mental illness, and we all know about the crisis that our prisons and jails have become with the growing numbers of people with mental illness, we can't just say, oh, they have a mental illness, right? There's diagnosable mental disorders, there's serious mental disorders, there's severe mental disorders, right? Our very skilled health providers and clinicians are going to be pulling apart that population to be much more nuanced to target the right health package to the right people. So David and the team at the Council of State Governments Justice Center started saying, we need to sort populations by their criminogenic risk, by their degree of substance abuse, by their degree of mental illness, and then package the right level of supervision with the right form of substance abuse treatment, with the right form of mental health treatment. If we don't do those things together, we're not going to get the results that are possible. We may even increase the likelihood of recidivism. We couldn't talk this way 10 years ago, right? We are much more sophisticated as a result of all this work. My question to you, how will you take this science that we have now and apply it to the system that currently exists? So in summary, I've shown you thanks to you, you've propelled the country in wonderful directions. I've also shown you where you fit in the national context and the regional context and some potential opportunities for improvement and the science that now exists that I think 10 years later is ripe for you to lead us to the next 10-year period. Thank you very much, and we look forward to continuing to work with you.
Good morning, everyone, and it's great to be here. It's wonderful, of course, always to follow my good friend from New Haven, Bill Dyson. Everywhere you go in the country and you mention Bill Dyson, somehow the subject of Clark's Dairy comes up. And I learned that during his time as head of the Appropriations Committee. And everybody knows that in CSSD we significantly increased our staffing and other resources over the years. And all I can tell you is that so much of that, in fact, more of it, happened over coffee at Clark's Dairy than in the halls of the Legislative Office building. So Clark's Dairy has a lot of history of significant contributions to the criminal justice system. It's also great to be here with Mike Thompson. I was surprised to hear that he's been with the Council of State Governments for 20 years because he still looks the same, you know? And he's been doing really great work, and it's a pleasure to be associated with him. So I thank you for the invitation, and I think we're really at a wonderful point in Connecticut where it's timely to reopen this whole discussion about justice reinvestment. I think in many respects we are at a crossroads, and I think we are soon to be able to identify very specifically the savings that are being achieved by many of the current strategies that have been put in place in our criminal justice system, and then to be able to link those savings to new investments in the communities from which the offenders typically come. Investments that I would characterize as pro-social. To me, that was always the concept of justice reinvestment, and I've been with this since the very beginning. I remember my friend Mike Lawler when he helped introduce this, and he said, this is really a way for us to get smart on crime. It's a way for us to move toward effective evidence-based practices and programs, to begin to invest in changing people from law-breaking to law-abiding. It's an opportunity for us to find meaningful punishments that are more effective and less costly than prison. The consequence of all of these actions should be that we save taxpayers money, and we do this by reducing the numbers of people who come through the criminal justice system, and therefore we should be spending less in the future on things like prisons. And optimally, the less that we are spending should be transferred to those neighborhoods that Mike so clearly identified in one of his graphics, where we need to make some social and economic investment that is really aimed at turning our posture from reactive to the event of a crime to proactive in preventing it. To me, that's what justice reinvestment was all about. So it would mean, for example, taking the savings and investing it in something like education or job training or housing, because housing is a significant issue in stabilizing people in the community, and in other kinds of community services that are not reactive but rather preventative. So I would say to you that we have been moving historically toward this really for the last 20 years. Now, I will say prior to that 20-year period, we were really moving in the opposite direction because we were responding to rising crime really by building prisons. And we did not cheap out on the notion of building prisons in our state. And I take some responsibility for that because I was chairman of the Prison Overcrowding Commission in the 1980s that charted the course. But we built 11,000 new beds over a decade. 11,000. We spent $1 billion of capital money. That's before any of them even opened. And by the time we ended it, we had more employees in the Department of Corrections than we had offenders when we started it. And the number of offenders was 4 times as many as when we started it. So I would say to you that up until the 90s, our reaction, we were totally reactive to the event of a crime. And we really didn't have a proactive plan for our future. Now, I would say to you that historically we began a new strategy in the 90s that is much more closely linked to the concept of justice reinvestment. That's when we began to invest in alternatives to incarceration. You see, the state by then had tired of the prison building process. Not only was it expensive, it took a long time to bring them online. And as much as communities all across the state in polls would say, yes, build more prisons, we'll do it, but not near me. And so the state more and more found itself in litigation and in problems in communities where we were trying to expand existing prisons and build new ones. So it was costly, time-consuming, and politically problematic. And so in the 90s, I will tell you, we started to move down this road of trying to change criminal behavior as the solution. The whole legislative movement toward alternative sanctions, what was it all about? It was about giving judges options between straight probation and straight prison so they could make sensible and rational choices that would hope to change behavior and at the same time be less costly to taxpayers. So many in this room were here in the 90s when we began that. We didn't have what we have today. We didn't have a lot of research telling us what works best to change criminal behavior. So we had a lot of people around the table who said, I think we can do things like AICs, we can do things like mental health treatment, and so we began to invest in those things. And over a period of several years, the legislature each year kept adding millions for new investment. And even though we didn't have a lot of research, when the University of Connecticut, Dr. Eleanor Lyon came in and studied alternatives in the late 1990s, what did she find? That when you evaluate the people who received alternatives against a like group of offenders who went to jail instead, the people who got alternatives had significantly lower recidivism rates 3 years later. So even though we didn't have proven effective program models, what we were doing was in fact reducing recidivism among our population. And of course, as Mike Lawler knows, that study that was done by UConn is really what spawned the whole investment in juvenile alternatives that started around 96, 97. Now, after the year 2000 in our state, I think we took yet another step in the direction of justice reinvestment. Because by then we had something that we didn't have in the early 1990s. We had actual research, international research, national research, and some within our own state of Connecticut on what specific things matter in terms of reducing crime. We knew we had studies that said lower caseloads helped to reduce crime. That's why I spent so much time with Bill Dyson and his successors in the Appropriations Committee saying, you know, if we're going to reduce caseloads, we need more officers, and they gave them to us. We learned that validated assessment tools, and Mike talked about the Ohio tools. We use level of service inventory. It's just as valid. We adopted it. So we're able to differentiate by risk. We're able to properly target criminogenic needs to evidence-based programs. We learned that completion rates matter, that when we have higher completion rates, we have lower recidivism rates. We learned that timeliness matters, that the extent to which we take a long time to get to our clients puts them at risk. We learned that the things we used to train them in were not as relevant anymore, that we needed to train them in how to motivate the whole change process. Enter motivational interviewing, client reinforcement. We also learned from international and national studies that cognitive behavioral therapies work best. That most of the people we deal with have, distorted thinking patterns that sort of guide them down this road to crime, but we needed to restructure that. And that's what CBT is all about. And then we did something called quality assurance. And if you had asked me back then what quality assurance is, I would have said, I have no idea. I know now. It's in our programs. We actually have to videotape everything that's done. And we have to have it evaluated. And we have to give feedback. And we do it in practices as well in the probation offices. So we've been gradually but surely putting all of these principles of evidence-based practice and programs in place in our state over the past 10 years. And each year, the legislature has been gradually increasing budgets for staffing and for programs. And all of this, by the way, has been happening against this backdrop in Connecticut of results-based accountability, one of the best things that the legislature ever did. And we were one of the first ones to raise our hands and say, we'll do it, because we want to measure ourselves. So results-based accountability says, all this money we're spending on court support services in the judicial branch, who is better off because we're doing it? It's all public money, so what does the public expect from us? They expect safer streets, safer communities. Well, how do we measure our contribution to safer communities? It's to the extent that we can reduce recidivism, not among the general population, but among our population. And I knew that if we implemented all of these strategies, and if we did that, we had a good chance of bringing recidivism rates down. And so, here we are, 2014. I think what we have proven in our state is that criminal behavior can be changed. We have all the evidence we need. And we know we're saving a lot of money. He talked about the Department of Corrections sentence population coming down. One of the reasons is we have fewer probationers getting rearrested. We used to have nearly half of probationers arrested 2 years later. It was 47% in 2007. It's now in the 41, 42%, down 5-6 points. Every point is 280 fewer rearrests in our state of probationers. That affects the crime rate when you take this population that is crime prone and you change their behavior. Technical violations, this was another thing mentioned, because the 2004 legislation challenged us to reduce it by 20%. When we did the study back then, and Mike Hynes is here, he's the one who did it in one of our offices, we found 50% of our violations were for technical reasons. Bill Dyson, Tony Harp, Tony Walker, they gave us officers to create technical violation units and money for services. That rate is now in the 30s, the low 30s. We met the mandate of the statute. We reduced it by more than 20%. We have shown lower recidivism rates in all categories. Domestic violence down to 10, 11%, 12 months later. And Renee LaMark-Muir is here as part of our panel. In 2004, she did this wonderful study of recidivism among the AIC clients. And her conclusion was that a year after, 44% of them were back into the system. And that has proven to be a great baseline. But what Connecticut did is say, what are we doing in AICs that we could do better? And so we decided to incorporate CBT programs, cognitive behavioral therapies like R&R, reasoning and rehabilitation, treating addictive disorders, to quality assure all their programs. You know what that rate is now? And I just looked at this last night, 29% for completers of AICs. And if anybody's here in the AIC system, you should be applauded, really, for the great work that is being done. And how about in our juvenile system? Connecticut ranks #1 in the country in terms of reducing juvenile incarceration. It's down over 70% in the last 10 years. #1 in the country. 12,000 kids come into the juvenile court system. Last year we sent 220 or so for out-of-home placements. Those kids used to go to Connecticut Juvenile Training School at great cost to taxpayers, or out-of-home placements at great cost to taxpayers. Talk about saving money. Millions and millions and millions being saved. But here's another factor. Those same kids are going on probation. Recidivism rates that used to be in the 60s are now in the high 50s, and they're coming down because we've put programs and support services in place. Status offenders that used to be in our juvenile system are now in family support centers where they belong. And Mike mentioned Raise the Age, one of the most important policy shifts we've made in the state of Connecticut in the last 20 years, and it's proving to be the right policy. They have lower rearrest rates than the under 16-year-olds. They have higher completion rates, and that will ultimately affect the prison population on the adult side in the years to come. So Connecticut has been moving steadily. And so now we have this proof that, yes, we can do better with this population. What we have not done well yet is we have not been able to pinpoint how much are we saving from the changes we've made in the juvenile system. How much are we saving from what we've done on technical violations? And take that block of money and commit it to the very locations where our clients are coming from for pro-social purposes. But I think we have an opportunity. The new Results Plus program, in which the Pew Foundation has been involved in our state, it's chaired by Mike Lawler and Tony Walker. We, CSSD, has been active players in that. What that is all about is looking at our strategies, looking at the evaluations we have, and projecting cost savings by putting these kinds of initiatives in place. So programs in the juvenile system like multisystemic therapy, functional family therapy, programs in the adult system, whether it's R&R or TAD or other initiatives, you can do that and you can target savings. The step that we need to take now is to identify those neighborhoods, do the kind of tracking that Mike's map showed is possible, and then begin to transform those savings into pro-social opportunities so that we can gather here at some point in the future for building bridges and say, here's another bridge that we've built. We're actually stopping these young people who otherwise would have come into our system from ever coming to the door of a police department and a court. How are we doing it? Because we're increasing opportunities for social, economic, and educational advancement right in the neighborhoods where they live. What better thing could we do for public service than that? So I'm hopeful, really, that over the next few years, we take this last but very important step toward a safer Connecticut and really deliver the taxpayers not just the quality of safety that they want in their homes, where they work, where they recreate, but also the economic savings to which they are entitled. Thank you.
Well, it's good to be back. It's good to see a lot of you that I worked with for so many years. So many smart people in this room. It's crazy. But I just have one confession to make. I did go over to the dark side, as Andrew said, so I'm sort of a one-person prison population overcrowding machine. But I try to make my arrests fair and keep them to a minimum if possible. But at the time, to go back, I mean, so many exciting things have happened, and it's hard to follow Mike and Bill, first of all, just because they're so good at what they do. But they sort of told you where we're at and all the great things that have happened over the years. So I almost don't want to drag you back to the future when things seemed a little bleak, at least from my perspective. But my job at the Program Review Committee was guided by the legislators on the committee. Mike Lawler was one of the leaders in sort of picking the topics every year that I was assigned. So it wasn't, I didn't get to pick my own topics. So it wasn't like I was out there saying, we need a study of recidivism or we need a study of bail services or anything like that. It was really guided by the legislators, the people on the committee, and even when he wasn't on the committee, behind the scenes, Bill and Mike. So I did get the criminal justice topics, and I'll just give you a brief overview of sort of what happened in the 20 years that I researched the criminal justice system. So when I started, my task was really to look at why we were having all these riots in the prison system. So that was in the late 80s and the early 90s, and the Department of Correction was just having serious riots in their sort of medium-high to high-level prison system. Basically what I found is that you have too many people crammed into a little box with nothing to do. So over time, the tensions built, and they were having riots. And the department was trying to respond to those riots by putting out the fires, sometimes literally, and they weren't having a lot of time, leisure time, or they didn't have the ability to sort of step back and look to see, well, what's going on and how could we stop these riots? All they were doing was hearing the bells, seeing the fighting, and they were running. So it was our job to kind of step in and look at that. Well, it wasn't too hard to figure out what was happening. They had too many people in little boxes. So Bill Carbone, who was the chair of the prison overcrowding system, they were kind of ahead of the curve. Our studies were really telling them what they already knew, and so they had to build more prisons. So that was sort of an immediate reaction to immediate serious problem. It wasn't really the long-term reaction because, as everybody now knows, you can't build your way out of a prison overcrowding crisis, right? If you build it, they will come, and that's what happened. So as the beds were coming online over that 10-year period, as Bill talked about, at a cost for $1 billion, those beds, they had 2 or 3, sometimes 5 or 6 people waiting for those beds before they were even bolted to the floor. So as soon as the doors opened, the judges knew the prisons were coming online. It trickled down. Everybody in the criminal justice system knew the beds were coming online, and they got filled immediately, and they had a waiting list. So that was sort of a long process. It was a 10-year process. So we got to see as one prison came on what the problem, and then as we saw it repeat as each prison opened, we got to step back a little bit because we did have the luxury of some new beds. We did have a little bit of luxury of stepping back and saying, okay, what can we do? Because we know in 10 years when we have all these beds online, we're going to be overcrowded. So again, Bill, Mike, the legislators in their wisdom, they started basically ordering me to do some studies. So we started looking at prison overcrowding as an issue. What can you do about prison overcrowding before you even get there? So, and Bill Carbone over at CSSD, they were implementing alternative sanctions. So a lot of stuff was sort of dovetailing at the same time. And it was my job to kind of float above the top and look down and see how all those pieces were coming together. And if some pieces were, out of whack, or if we needed more in another area. So the studies basically that we looked at, they found that the alternative sanctions program, you were getting a better bang for your buck, but it was hard to right that ship. If you think of the criminal justice system as a big ship, right? The iceberg is right there. It's kind of, you can't just spin it on a dime and turn it around and go the other way. So that iceberg was there for a lot of years, maybe like 10, 12 years, and we just kept trying to veer away from it. But it was really slowly. You had to change public policy. You had to change long-term budget, state budgeting practices. You had to change the way people worked, trickle down to the workers out in the field and in the prisons, and you had to change their perspective. And in some ways, the population that the criminal justice system deals with, they had to change because, they were used to getting a 5-year prison sentence, going in for 10% of that, getting out on SHR, and disappearing until they got arrested again, which most of them did numerous times. So anyway, it was changing slowly. So we did a lot of studies, and we found everything that, you all know now that, you sort of all take for granted. But back then, we were kind of like, hey, look, the numbers are supporting what we know anecdotally. Anecdotally, we know what Bill was telling us is that if there's a certain percentage of the population that you don't need to put in prison, give them to me, let me give them these services, give me the staff to give them those services, and I'll give you a better bang for your buck. So initially, way back when, 15 years ago, it was sort of blind faith in Bill. I mean, he did have some research-based information, but here in Connecticut, it wasn't proven. So then we had the time, as those programs came online, we had the time to prove that what we believed anecdotally was in the data was empirically true. So a lot of the studies I did on alternative sanctions and prison overcrowding and substance abuse practices and juvenile justice and all that kind of stuff, we were getting the data that empirically was proving that the professionals that the legislature was trusting and that the ideas that the legislators had were true. So now that big ship started to turn a little bit faster, and we were getting away. But the Department of Correction's job is to run prisons, and that is not a criticism. That's what they do, and they do it well. And we need them, because for a criminal justice system to be effective, it has to know that there are available prison beds. Because there are some people that no matter how great our alternative sanction programs are, parole is, probation is, diversionary programs are, there are some people that need to go to prison. And we have to have the confidence that we have that bed available, and that bed's going to be available for the period of time that we need to use it. So when we talk about moving away from incarcerating people, that doesn't diminish the role of the Department of Corrections and the great job that it does in doing what it does, which is running prisons. So I think based on all of the studies I was doing, the hardest thing that we found over time to do was to get away from that thinking that not building prisons and not sending people to jail was a criticism of the Department of Corrections, or that we still didn't need to fund that it was still part of the criminal justice system. So we had to have a better way of funding everything. And that's what, when the Justice Reinvestment came around, that's what it was. It was to look at, we have to fund everything, but right now we have the majority of our resources going to the Department of Corrections, which even on a bad day, only supervises the smallest percentage of the offender population, sentenced and unsentenced, that's in the state, right? A very small percentage of people actually go to prison that are considered in that wide world of offender population. So the Justice Reinvestment and Mike Thompson and Bill Carbone and just all the smart people that were working in the criminal justice system at the time, they helped everybody start thinking about where's the best way to spend our dollars, the same way everybody does in your own household or in your own business, right? You want to, I have $10, what's the best way to spend it? So that's what Justice Reinvestment did. And one of the things Justice Reinvestment did was set up performance-based measures. So when we're talking about things like reinvestment and recidivism and overcrowding, everybody was throwing around a lot of broad terms that weren't necessarily defined. So again, the legislature came back to us at Program Review, and they asked us to define some of those terms so that we could better measure them, and then we can better budget our resources. So we did the recidivism study, and we were the monitors of the oversight for the Justice Reinvestment. And again, in determining the definition of recidivism, we had to start with just the basics of what is recidivism, because all the different criminal justice agencies defined it slightly different. So we had to find that common consensus, and we couldn't pick just one step. You can't just say everybody who's arrested, because a lot of people who get arrested, they're found not guilty, or it gets nollied, or it gets dismissed, so there's a whole host of things that happen. So that's why we came up with that, Mike showed you that chart. We came up with that 4-tiered definition, and we said that you really needed to consider all of those points when you wanted to measure recidivism. So that was one of the reasons that we did the recidivism study. And again, it sort of highlighted what we knew anecdotally, but it also provided us with some empirical data to support some of that stuff. Like, for example, that the alternative sanctions program and things like that, even though people were recidivating at what we considered a sort of a high rate, that they were still more effective in diverting people from rearrest, reconviction, and reincarceration than just prison or just straight supervision in parole or probation, that there had to be other things tied to that. So I think in overview, what we found in doing a retrospective of what we were looking at all of those studies was that you had to specifically define what you're talking about. So it was great 10 years ago to throw around the term of justice reinvestment, but what does that actually mean? What's the definition? When you look that up on Wikipedia, what does it mean? What are the points of reinvestment that you're trying to get to? Because everybody in here could sort of have a different idea of what reinvestment is depending on where you are in the system. If you're the head of the Department of Correction, or if you're a counselor in an AIC, your definition of that is going to be different. So we thought it's important that everybody have the same definition and understand what the playing field is when the decisions are made at the state budget level and the policy level. So we worked on that. And then in 2006, we had to present, the last report I'll talk about, in 2006, we had to present the first of 2 statutorily required monitoring reports of how justice reinvestment went. Now, obviously, my results in 2006 are outdated because Mike, it's hard to follow Mike, but Mike did such a good job of showing over the 10-year period how successful that program was. And now looking back at it, I can see that 2 years out, which really is probably more like 18 months out by the time everybody geared up to do this, at the 2006 mark, it was a little disheartening because it didn't seem like, that big ship was moving fast enough. That there was still a lot of concern about what did these big broad terms like recidivism and reinvestment and changes in the system, what did all of those things meant? Because there didn't seem to be any sort of centralized leadership in the criminal justice system, because every agency still had its own mandate. And, for example, CSSD couldn't tell the state courts what to do, and the state courts can't tell correction what to do. So there didn't seem to be anything centralized. That was a big finding that we found. We also found that, which was sort of a natural finding, is that the more community-based services, like probation and parole, that they were having more of an impact than incarceration, which that was what you would hope to find, and we did find that. And we also found that it was difficult at the time to say that recidivism was going down because 2 years out after, and it was about 3 or 4 years out after our recidivism study, nobody had picked up the ball in the state and was really running and tracking recidivism. So I think that's an issue that Mike has found that's still a little bit lacking. It's sort of the cornerstone of this whole concept, that it's the main measurement of your success of justice reinvestment. It's, you could talk about public safety, but what do you mean when you say improving public safety? It's reducing recidivism. So until you measure that, and Mike is absolutely 100% right, if you can't, right now, today, click on a website and find out what the recidivism rate is for last year or even 2 years out, you've sort of, that's your North Star. You've sort of lost that star. You don't know where you're steering, okay? So to use that ship analogy, you're turning away from the iceberg, but where do you go? What if there's another iceberg on your right? You need that North Star. So if that's lacking, I would say, one of the things I would say, I know I'm supposed to be talking about retrospective, but going forward, I think that's a key component. You need to have that data, and everybody in the system should be able to access that data and break it down in different ways and to look at how it applies to their little shop and then how their little shop applies to the system as a whole. And so ultimately we found in 2006 was that we couldn't say whether justice reinvestment worked. We didn't see the dollars. DOC's budget was still really high. They had crazy overtime. We could see that there was some reinvestment in CSSD, that they did use the money that they were given under the initial reinvestment project. They did use it wisely. They hired staff. They implemented programs. And in the numbers, you can see that their recidivism was going down. But across the board, it was difficult to say whether 2 years out, justice reinvestment worked. So again, now with the luxury of hindsight, 2 years out for a massive change in a public policy, you wouldn't expect to see huge changes. So I think when I wrote the report, I was a little disheartened. I was kind of like, oh, come on, people. But now, 10 years out, I could look and see that, you need to crawl before you can walk. So, maybe in those 2 years, the system was crawling, but it definitely, after listening to Mike and Bill, crawled for a little while and then got up and took off running. So that was great to see. So basically, in summary, what I was responsible for was sort of providing the research and laying the groundwork and kind of highlighting. I know a lot of people didn't like to see my reports coming out when they came out, because part of my job was to highlight the areas of deficiency or the problems, and I think most importantly, lost opportunity. So it was important to say, as a system, hey, we had an opportunity here. It's not too late. So I always tried to look at it in the positive, even though I know a lot of times when I presented my report, there was some unhappy faces. But it's really good to see that everything has gone for the positive, and hopefully it'll keep going forward. And there's lots of still smart people in the system, and all of this stuff can be used for good. And I'll finish with saying that I will try to keep my arrest to a minimum.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to correct a couple of things. Number one is I wasn't in the legislature for 30 years. It might have seemed that way. It was 26 years. I think Bill Dyson was over 30 years, 32 years. And I would say I served on the Appropriations Committee with Bill Dyson, but somehow with all the time I spent there, I never got invited to Clark's Dairy, so I don't know what happened there. But I was ranking member of the Judiciary Committee for 10 years, from 1997 to 2007. But at the same time I was ranking member of the Judiciary, or for most of that time, I was also on the Appropriations Committee and the ranking member of its subcommittees on both corrections and higher education. I was very supportive of the funding for UConn and was appalled to find that we were spending more money on running prisons than on running the University of Connecticut and all the state universities combined. And that's still the case today. We're spending more money on incarcerating people in prison than we do on the state university system and UConn combined. But finding ways to reduce the correction costs without jeopardizing public safety was not easy. I was invited here because of the fact that the interesting question is, how did this become a bipartisan effort in Connecticut? And it was largely because of the fact that we knew what things no one wanted to repeat. I was aware of the supervised home release program that was used in the 1980s called SHR, in which prisoners were released after serving as little as 10% of their time without any supervision or support. Although it was called supervised home release, they never had the personnel necessary to actually supervise them properly. The SHR program left judges and victims and even inmates unsure of how much time they would actually have to serve in jail. When victims and judges saw inmates get sentences of up to 3 years, returning to the streets in 3 months, their faith in the judicial system was lost. Public safety was jeopardized, and because of the revolving door system, inmates being rearrested again, the prison population continued to increase. That was an example of what we didn't want to see repeated in Connecticut. In 1999, I made my first small attempt to make reentry of released prisoners more successful. I found that some inmates who were released into the community didn't have any form of identification and couldn't obtain one from the Department of Motor Vehicle without first getting documents like birth certificates. Sometimes this took them weeks and delayed the opportunity to obtain employment. I supported passage of a bill that required the Motor Vehicle Department to issue an ID to anybody with a proper inmate ID from the Department of Corrections. Sounded like a simple solution to a problem. The next year, the bill was repealed with my support when we found out that the integrated computer system at the Department of Corrections would issue IDs to inmates under the name they were booked with. If the inmate gave an alias at the time of the booking, DOC would keep that in there as his name, and when it came to get an ID from the Department of Motor Vehicle, the Motor Vehicle Department didn't want to have one issued under the inmate's under the inmate's alias name. So I had to admit defeat on this issue and wait for other solutions to solve the problem. But I did learn how challenging the supposedly simple process of reentry can be. When you have inmates going out and they don't even have an ID card, and it's difficult to even solve that problem. Criminal justice policy in the legislature has always depended on what types of crimes have recently been committed. And I think there's been references to that before. When you have high-profile crimes such as Cheshire, the Cheshire murders or the Newtown tragedy, the legislature devotes its time to passing newer, tougher laws. When there's no high-profile crimes, the legislature normally pays little attention to the criminal justice system, except at budget time. In the 2001 report from the legislature's Program Review and Investigation Committee, which Renee worked on, was the first recidivism study of offenders done by the legislature in Connecticut. This report was an eye-opener. It verified that most offenders released from prison were eventually rearrested and reincarcerated, generally sooner rather than later. The report also verified that most existing in-prison programs had only a small impact on recidivism. I've always been aware that some inmates were doing life sentences on the installment plan. As a legislator, I always told my constituents that the most important thing the criminal justice system could do to inmates was to make sure they don't do their crime again. Very simple charge to the Department of Corrections, make sure they don't reoffend when they come out. The Building Bridges Conference in 2003 demonstrated for the first time that most inmates were coming from major cities, and then when they were released, they re-entered the neighborhoods that they came from. And that map that Mike Thompson showed earlier was shown to the legislature and had a big impact on changing some of the thought process here. And it pointed out that the state was spending hundreds of millions of dollars on incarcerating these inmates, but little money to reintegrate them successfully back into the community. It cost almost $40,000 a year to incarcerate each prisoner, if you include the pension costs and other things that normally aren't looked at. How much should we be willing to spend to avoid a reincarceration of a prisoner? When Public Act 04-234 was proposed in the legislature, it provided for expansion of supervised release of inmates with proper supervised supportive services in the community. It required state agencies to develop comprehensive strategies for reentry. It offered hope that the state would reduce its incarcerated population and thus reduce the cost of incarceration while increasing public safety. And this is what got it bipartisan support. That was finally recognized that this was the goal. We didn't want to go back to the SHR days of just releasing people early without supervision and saying, well, we're saving money in corrections, because we don't want to do that at the cost of public safety deteriorating. The next year, the legislature passed Public Act 05-249, which created the Criminal Justice Policy and Planning Commission, known as CJPAC. This act required an ongoing analysis of the criminal justice system. It required both monthly and annual reports on such things as prison populations, the effectiveness of programs, and recidivism rates. This legislation was also passed on a bipartisan program, with bipartisan support. There is really no divide in the legislature about what the overall goal ought to be. It is to bring down the cost of corrections, the cost of the criminal justice system, while improving public safety. And as Mike did that great graph where he showed where we want to move to, the problem in the past is people want to incarcerate more people, so you ended up with this division of Republicans saying, well, lock them up and throw away the key, and Democrats say, no, we got to help them back into the community as quickly as possible without that incarceration. And there was always a division that I don't think exists today in the state of Connecticut. I think we've identified the goals clearly. In the future, one of the opportunities we have for improving the system now which hasn't been mentioned, is the Sentencing Commission. It brings all the major players in the criminal justice arena together. It gives us an opportunity to review the criminal justice statutes and analyze their effectiveness for reducing crimes. One of the things I think that should be stressed here is someone said that we're going to go to the final steps in improving the system. There's not going to be a final step in improving the system. This is going to be a continuum. We're going to be doing this for as long as any of you are involved here. We're always going to be trying to improve the system. With luck, we're going to bring down recidivism rates. It will come down slowly. There isn't any magic bullet that's going to solve the problem overnight. But if we've got the information, the feedback that Renee talked about, so that we can identify what works and what doesn't work, continue to improve those, invest in the programs and the policies that work, and continue to improve the outcome, we'll have a better state of Connecticut, and we'll have a government that maybe costs a little less than it does now. So thank you very much.
There's a lot more that I'd like to say about justice reinvestment than time allows. And as Andrew noted, that my transcript is available on his website, so you can check that out. You don't need to take notes because they're all there. Now, every time I make remarks in forums like this, and I've been on so many of them, I can't count now, I really attempt very hard to express my views and my perspectives as honestly as I can. I don't claim to have a handle on the truth with a capital T by any means. They simply represent my perspective. Also, what I say, therefore, does not necessarily represent the views of the Department of Correction or anybody else in the state government. They're simply my views. I'd like to begin my comments today by asking you to imagine something. Put on your thinking caps here. I want you to imagine that 5 years ago, the state of Connecticut stopped putting anyone in jail or prison. Absolutely no one in jail or prison 5 years ago. Among other possible effects, I think we can be assured of four. First, victims of crime, especially serious crimes, would be outraged. They would believe that justice was not being served. The just desserts philosophy is embraced by a lot of our citizens, a lot of people here, of course. Second, we would have eliminated what criminologists refer to as an incapacitation effect. To use an example, if a man has been in a habit of regularly stealing cars, is incarcerated for a period of time, then during that time, at least, he can't steal cars. It is, of course, possible on the very day that he's released, he steals another car. Criminologists have estimated the incapacitation effect. It is not inconsequential. It exists. It's real. It's not a good way to do it, but it's real. Third, our not locking anybody up at all would reduce both specific and general deterrence. Let's start with specific deterrence. You will recall that some years ago, Martha Stewart was incarcerated, ultimately as a result of her being engaged in insider stock trading. She was thus forced to live in a time in a gated community, not up to her culinary or stylistic standards, I'm sure, and it wasn't very pleasant for her. Let us imagine that last weekend she was hosting a dinner party, and her friend Harry comes up to her and says, "Martha, psst, I got some inside information for you." And Martha says, "No way, Harry. Been there, done that. I want nothing to do with it." That would be an example of specific deterrence. Now let's imagine that Harry approaches someone else in the dinner party and says, "Hey, psst, I got some really good information." And that person says, "Wait a minute. I saw what Martha went through. I don't want to go through that. I'm not interested." That would be an example of general deterrence. So to sum up so far, we would have eliminated the incapacitation and reduced deterrence. We could reasonably expect that we would see an increase in the crime rate. Given the uproar that I would expect from victims and the increased rate of crime, I would predict that the state would reinstate incarceration. As we slowly started to incarcerate individuals, we would be wise to conduct a cost-benefit analysis. Were we to do that, I would counsel people to examine three types of costs. The first is the actual dollar cost. We're spending, what, $2 or $3 billion probably in criminal justice, I imagine. Okay. Second, whatever benefit we might experience from locking people up, there are also social collateral costs. My friend Bill Dyson here was just talking about that earlier on. The man who is incarcerated is also a son, a husband, a father, a neighbor. You all know neighborhoods that have been decimated by mass incarceration. You've seen them. I've been in them. The third cost that should be considered is what economists refer to as opportunity costs. When the state of Connecticut spends a couple of $1 billion on the criminal justice system, it cannot also fund, at least adequately fund, other very important, even critical programs that could make a real difference in the lives of individuals, families, neighborhoods, and communities. Now let's take a look at this graphic. That is a theoretical depiction. It's up there, yep. As I reviewed the relationship between rates of incarceration, costs, and benefits, I would expect that the public would initially be quite pleased that we were getting bad people off the streets, dangerous people. Specifically, I would predict that there would be a consensus that the cost incurred would be worth the benefits. You see that chart there. We see this depicted on the left side of the graph. But as we incarcerated more and more people, the marginal benefits would diminish. The total cost would steadily increase by that straight line there. And at some point, there would be a crossover, at which time the cost would exceed the benefits. There is no credible expert that I've ever heard from in the criminal justice system anywhere in the country, or the world for that matter, who doesn't believe that we long ago in the United States passed that point. Theoretically, here's where the concept of justice reinvestment comes into play. It starts with the idea that if we were to substantially reduce the prison population, that we would be able to save a lot of money and reinvest some of that money. Now, since I have never, in recent years, heard anyone in state government talk about a specific plan, which I'm very concerned about. You know that old commercial, like, where's the beef? Remember that one? So, justice reinvestment, it's a great idea. Where's the beef? I should be Bill Dyson up here saying that. Bill would say something like that, wouldn't he? Where's the beef? Okay. So since we don't have a plan that I know of, let's look at my plan here. Okay. Let's use some round numbers. Let's say the approximate budget of the DOC is $600 million. If we reduce our budget by 12.5%, that would translate to a savings of $75 million annually. Step one would be that the legislature's Office of Fiscal Analysis and the executive branch's Office of Policy and Management would come to an agreement about how to determine the actual savings. So the question I would like for everybody is, has that been done? Is there a metric? Has OPM and the Office of Fiscal Analysis actually sat down and discussed this? If we're committed to doing this, that step has to take place. I don't think it's taken place. Okay, step two would be that they would agree on a plan. So we have to decide, how much money do we really save? Is this sausage, or do we really have data, you know? Step one would be that they would do that. And then step two would be that they would agree on a plan to disperse this money. There's no dispersal plan, so let's use my plan. Use 1/3 to retire debt. This must be in addition to whatever money was already allocated to retire debt. I believe that it would be a political imperative to do that. I don't think this would go anywhere if we didn't do that. And besides that, it makes sense fiscally, doesn't it really? It's prudent. Create a grant program available to Connecticut's 4 biggest cities. These 4 cities contribute approximately 1/2 of the entire sentenced and unsentenced population of our prison system. Our major cities are in desperate need of help. They're in desperate need of help. That's the truth. The solicitation would require that certain questions be answered, including the following. A, explain how this investment would reduce crime. B, identify areas of concentrated poverty and explain how you are going to address the interwoven problems associated with concentrated poverty, including deteriorated housing stock, poor educational outcomes, high unemployment, poor health outcomes, and victimization. Isn't it a shame that in this state, for a number of different years that I'm aware of, we had the highest racial disparity, not only with regard to criminal justice outcomes, but with regard to health outcomes and education outcomes all at the same time? That's our state. If you awarded this grant during the first 2 years, report what local colleges and universities partnered with you to help conduct a formative process evaluation. Universities like this university. Identify corporate and philanthropic organizations who have partnered with you. Describe the type and amount of both cash and in-kind support that they have pledged. Get them involved. Describe the role that faith-based communities will play in this plan. Faith-based communities are terribly ignored in this whole process. They have an important role to play. Each year, savings would be calculated, and if the population continues to be reduced in those areas in relation to other areas, the grants would increase. Peg the amount to the marginal cost savings resulting from the reduction of incarceration. 3, invest 1/3 of the savings, the last third, to address the opportunity cost issue. Utilize the grant process as described below. Grantees would be expected to address the following. Provide evidence that this investment or investments are evidence-based. If at least a secondary effect of the intervention would ultimately reduce crime, you get extra points for that. If evidence is provided that this investment is vital, for example, it prevents serious illness, death, etc., extra points will be given. Okay, so far so good. Until someone yells foul. Wait a minute, 1 second. Wait 1 minute, a conservative legislator raises his hand. This population reduction would happen to some degree by shortening sentences, right? Yes, that's true. Isn't it the case that some individuals during that period of early release will commit crimes? Yes, that's true. Hasn't that always been the case? Yes, that's true. It's always been the case. Won't that always be the case? Yes, that's true. That's true. Then why on God's green earth would we do that? I haven't made this up. This is what people have said to me for years. Why would we do this? And when these events happen, they have a bad effect, right? And we have to address them not when the effect happens, but before that. We need to educate people. That's a good question, I would answer. This plan is going to start reducing the flow of individuals moving into a career criminal path that often lasts decades. The number of crimes reduced by this strategy will dwarf the relatively rare, albeit sometimes horrible crimes that are committed during the period of discretionary release. Another legislator says, wait a minute, how can I justify to my constituency spending this much money on a relatively few municipalities? My answer would be as follows. First of all, this proposal necessitates our not spending more money overall, but redistributing the money we are now spending to incarcerate individuals. Second, it calls for a regular payment to unfunded mandates, such as our existing debt, unfunded pensions, etc. Third, I would suggest that allocating money to the cities is like allocating money following damage from a calamity, such as a hurricane. No one would question why funds weren't provided to Salisbury for a hurricane that struck the Connecticut coastline. It wouldn't make sense. An appropriately skeptical legislator might ask, how do you know if this is going to work? Well, that would be a great question. If a number of cities are awarded a grant, I do not expect that all would have the same level of results. That is why, in this proposal, the grantees will have to establish what is described by research scientists who've done this here, by the way, at Central, I know, as a formative process evaluation. This requires the establishment of a logic model that is consistent with current research. The researchers will work with the group over a 2-year period to identify stumbling blocks, and there are always stumbling blocks, and to help them resolve these stumbling blocks. We would insist that staff from the different city projects meet on a quarterly basis to provide mutual support. Now, it is also important to remember that we cannot simply throw money at these problems. Communities have to take a great deal of responsibility to bring the entire community together to solve these very complicated and interconnected problems. Grants will not automatically be continued. Rather, a requirement of continued funding will be that they are demonstrating progress. This idea is a fundamental tenet of results-based accountability, that is, to track outcomes and to try to improve them, or in RBA terms, to turn the curve. After the 2-year period of outcome data will be collected, right from the start, everyone will know what we expect to get from this investment. And if we don't get it, the investment will cease. I think it is worthwhile to go back to something to point out one of the, I think, most outstanding contributions ever made within the criminal justice field by a bold visionary, I believe. He was able to establish a randomized control trial that followed conviction. I'm not sure that was clear when Bill was talking before. It was a randomized control trial. That's incredible, that under the protocols that were established, some were randomized to incarceration, some were randomized to an AIC. That had a huge impact on the state. So we are capable of doing really, really bold things here. Now, a number of the panelists looked at a lot of what we learned, especially about this whole risk, need, responsivity approach and all those assessments. However, with all that we have learned over the years, as well described by my fellow panelists, it is important to remember that virtually all of this is based on a medical paradigm, focusing on specific individuals and what can we do about assessing specific individuals. Now, what's going to happen when we attempt to change the conversation? What's going to happen when we take a more ecologically focused analysis and say, wait a minute here, we have people growing up in specific toxic, concentrated areas of poverty. Are we going to tackle that? It's much easier for us to look at this man or this man or this man or that woman and try to figure out, doing an R&R model, what to do about them. What's going to happen when politically we have to address that? In my view, the major problem we're facing right now is not a technical one. It's a political one. Thank you.